Hi everybody, welcome back to our third and final video for today. So, this final section will be covering the Warsaw Ghetto Uprisings as well as resistance movements against the Nazis' attempt at annihilation. Again, if the content becomes too much, feel free to step out for a moment and do what you need to do and then come back. So, it is important to note wherever Nazi power reached, people resisted. Individual and collective acts of defiance, sabotage of military and industrial productions, attempts at rescuing people that were targeted for killing, and there were big supporters, with communist resistance groups typically being sponsored by the Soviet Union and nationalist guerrilla movements supported by the British Special Operations Executive Office. It's also important to note a lot of resistance fighters were made up of targets of the Nazis who also fought back. People with disabilities, the Roma, Jewish people especially, played a large role in resistance movements. So, before we get too far into this, it's important to provide a definition of what is resistance. Well, it's actions taken with the intent of thwarting Nazi German goals in the war, including genocide. It's tempting to offer this as an antidote of the depressing subject of the Holocaust, but some big things are typically left out. Jews made up a massive percentage of the French resistance and the Soviet resistance specifically, and they went unrecognized. While the resistance movements did have crucial impacts, their contributions are heavily neglected in most mainstream histories. Now, with any movement, there are obviously obstacles, the barriers typically being enormous. The Nazi policy of exacting reprisals made entire communities suffer, and this is done on a scale massively out of proportion. For one person killed, they may kill 50 to 200 people. Excuse me. An example of this is Ladies. In May 1942, Czech soldiers are going to shoot Reinhard Heydrich, that guy we've been talking about a lot, from various other things. Well, he dies like a week later. And in response, the Germans then destroy the entire village. They murder all 199 men there, as well as many women and children. The image on this slide being one of the memorials to the victims that were massacred. It's important to understand that those that did survive were typically sent off to be Germanized. This was also an opportunity to counter charges that they had gone along too easily with the Nazis. That's why the Czech resistance movement did this. Now, the total death toll of this is estimated to be in the thousands, with Jews usually being left out of the count, meaning the 199 men that were murdered were people they would have considered to be German, not Jewish people or any other group that was targeted for destruction. In terms of the Jewish ghettos, policies of reprisals also explain, in general, why revolts generally only occurred after certain death was planned for those that lived there. A major example being in 1943 when a group of Jewish fighters escapes the Vilna ghetto to join partisans. In retaliation, the Gestapo seized their families, local Jewish leaders and their families, and any friends that had lived with them, and killed them all. Now you may be thinking, gosh, this is a lot of violence. And we literally in the last video talked about how secrecy was impossible. How did the Allies not know? They did know. Many anti Nazi organizations took risks to collect and share information. One of the major examples being Jan Karski, who carried a report to the Polish government in exile in fall of 1942. He was asked to relay the situation of Polish Jews as well, and they snuck him into a transit ghetto in Izbika, dressing him as a Ukrainian guard. He saw what was happening. Well, he delivered those reports as promised and spoke with Allied leaders like Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt. Nothing came of those meetings. It highlights the issue of Allied knowledge of Nazi crimes. We knew what was going on, but we didn't do anything. Gerhard Reiner, the World Jewish Congress representative, sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department and the British Foreign Office outlining exactly what the Germans were doing. But again, nothing came of it. So we need to ask ourselves, why did the Allies not say anything? Take a couple minutes, discuss with your table partner, and then be prepared to discuss as a class. Now, in the camps, they also tried to get the word out. In 1944, members of the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz-Birkenau took pictures and sent them to the Polish underground, with this image here of bodies being burned being one of the major examples. A lot of this evidence will then be used for the Nuremberg trials in coming years. Now, Jewish armed resistance specifically, more widespread than people assumed, and it's often downplayed because it contradicts the narrative of Jews as innocent victims. But the most tangible, effective form of resistance was military service. That's not something we normally look at. Jews participated in all of the armies that fought Germany. And armies that were defeated, Jews were among those most likely to fight on. A great example of this is they played a crucial role in gathering intelligence in North Africa that helped the landings for Operation Torch. The largest number of Jews serving in any of the militaries that we could talk about is the Soviet Army. They also were going to suffer the highest mortality rates, just like non-Jews in the army. It's important to understand, though, Soviet Jews succeeded in passing as Muslims and had a higher chance of escaping. Now, Germans specifically were unprepared for Bukharan Jews, or Jews from Central Asia. They did not speak Yiddish, and Muslims did practice some similar cultural traditions, like including not eating pork, those being very similar traditions between both of those religions. Now, and I totally forgot to move on to the next slide. Polish Jews as well are going to fight in the Soviets' Polish exile force. They're heavily forgotten about during the height of the Cold War, because of the Cold War. Even though they played a massive role in the whole process, they are completely forgotten in this sense. Now, resistance differed considerably with regards to timing. For Jews, it typically came out of places of hopelessness, especially for young people, because they had nothing to lose. For non-Jews, it came from an opposite impulse, typically wanting to see something to be gained from fighting back and wanting to serve a role in liberation and the future of their homelands. It's also important to understand people all across Europe joined partisan movements. They all struggled for survival, living hand to mouth, stealing food when necessary, arranging secret deliveries of food, and spending hours and sometimes days in holes in the ground under threat. It's also important to understand the treatment of Jews within these resistance movements. Afraid of the presence of Jews, some non-Jews even turned on and killed their Jewish counterparts that were members of their resistance cells. That's pretty dark. Now, in the Eastern European woods, Jews that managed to make it there, they managed to gather weapons, commit acts of sabotage, get married, have kids, and we know of at least 30 different resistance groups. In Lithuania alone in 1942, there were 10,000 Jews fighting as partisans. They're also going to form their own underground fighting groups, with the Bielski partisans in western Belarus being led by Tuvia Bielski. By 1944, more than 1,200 Jews were members of that movement specifically. These groups are typically pretty small, poorly armed, and chances of succeeding were minimal. But it's also important to note the role of women within these groups. They're also going to continue to resist as well. A great example of resistance in Auschwitz, a dancer distracted a guard long enough to take his gun and shoot him. And then also, by October 1944, Jewish prisoners are going to blow up one of the camp's crematoriums as well. Excuse me. I am so sorry about that. Now, probably to get into the main event of this section, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is one of the last places an uprising was expected for the Germans, so they're completely caught off guard. By early 1943, about 80% of the ghetto had already been emptied and had been sent to the camps and murdered, so they had very little support at first. We have two main groups we need to talk about: the Jewish Fighting Organization, which had less than 500 fighters, and the Jewish Military Union, which was not as well known. They may have had more members, and they were typically only armed with gasoline bombs, hand grenades, and a very small amount of firearms. It seemed really unlikely that they'd be able to accomplish anything beyond mass suicide. Now, in January 1943, the SS planned to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto. But then they're surprised by armed resistance. This, combined with the defeat at Stalingrad that had just happened, they gave up after a few days and, backed off. which is kind of crazy when you think about it. They returned 4 months later, in April, way better armed, with about 2,000 men on their sides, armed to the teeth. Warsaw Jews had built bunkers, tunnels, and underground passages. They held off the Germans for 4 weeks. So really, they weren't going to go down without a fight. The SS are going to burn down buildings and smoke Jews out of the bunkers. It's important to note that this crushed the uprising at the high cost of life. Only about 16 German soldiers would be killed, but the numbers are a lot higher if you look at Jews and Polish civilians. Small pockets of Jews will hold out longer, but in the end, 56,000 will surrender. Most of them will be shot on the spot, others transported to the camps, with thousands of dead remaining under the rubble, and only about 100 people managed to escape. The Polish resistance was effectively crushed on October 2nd, 1944, if we're kind of looking ahead at those that had managed to escape. This also represents the first large-scale urban revolt that cost 250,000 lives in Warsaw. That's a huge number. Hearing from the experience of Thaddeus Teddy Stabholes, who wrote about this in his memoir, Seven Hells. During the attack, for 2 hours, we stand silently while our group gets larger as more people are discovered. I recognize some of them, young people with old faces. Oh God, how people can change in such a short time. Now we are 30. Several SS men surround us, their rifles cocked ready to shoot. March, one orders. This was after being found in a secret tunnel. Now, we've talked a lot about Jewish resistance. We also have to talk about Romani resistance because that was also a thing. May 16th is celebrated as Romani Resistance Day in Europe, and it commemorates the Romani prisoners who defied efforts to liquidate the Gypsy family camp in Bergen. With Otto Rosenberg, and feel free to read this quote if you'd like, describing his experience. It's important to note, due to this resistance, the gassing would be postponed until 1944. Now, people made efforts to live. People targeted to try to stay alive, but they had few options. It's also important to note that not all Jews ended up at killing centers. Some sought refuge in other places and fled. Some were able to pass as non-Jews, and a lot of people went into hiding. With a number of about 80,000 to 120,000 Jews in Poland going into hiding, about half of them will actually survive the war. Most those that were in hiding were children. They were easier to hide and easier to pass as non-Jews. It was also easier for girls to be hidden than boys due to certain religious customs that are customary in Judaism. We also have to talk about spiritual resistance. Amidah, which is Hebrew for standing up against, it's used to understand this sense of resistance. It can also be applied to acts of kindness. It gave people a reason to live. All right, let's talk about your final assessment for today. So take a few minutes as we wrap up today to respond to the following prompt. You must write a minimum of 5 sentences. How did the partisans impact the lives of Jewish people in Europe? Did it help to know what people were fighting against the Germans? Excuse me. Did it help to know that people were fighting against the Germans? Excuse me. And finally, here are the sources that were used for the creation of today's lesson. I will see you all next time. Bye, guys.